Hello hockey fans, Oddman Rush here and welcome back to another video. Several months ago, I released a video looking at various NHL players who have been arrested by the police at some point during their respective careers. Now, judging by the response to that video, you guys really wanted me to make a part 2, so let's revisit the topic once again and highlight another batch of hockey players turned criminals. So in today's video, join me as we look at 10 more NHL players who were arrested. Kicking things off, we have Dino Ciccarelli. One of the best scorers of his era, Dino Ciccarelli would spend parts of 19 seasons in the NHL. He would score 608 goals and 1,200 points in 1,232 games, and make 4 appearances at the NHL All-Star Game too. Oh, and he was also inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame back in 2010, just in case you weren't impressed enough already, you know. Now, in the midst of his tenure with the Minnesota North Stars, the Canadian forward would have a run-in with the law, as on November 25th, 1987, Ciccarelli was arrested for indecent exposure. According to reports at the time, Ciccarelli had supposedly exposed himself to a female neighbour and her son 3 times over a 2-month period, but the forward wasn't detained until police found him sitting on his front porch in nothing but a sweater. As a result, Ciccarelli was charged with indecent assault and was sentenced to 50 hours of community service for his crimes. Interestingly, this incident wouldn't be the only time that Ciccarelli would face legal trouble, as he was sentenced to a day in jail on August 24, 1988, following his on-ice assault of Toronto Maple Leafs rookie Luke Richardson in January of that year. He is also alleged to have been involved in some pretty heinous stuff in May of 1990, but given the awful subject matter and the fact that he was never convicted for it, despite the police having, quote, sufficient grounds to believe a criminal offence did occur, I'd rather not go into the specifics of it right now. Perhaps another time. Next up, we have Bob Probert. One of the toughest enforcers the NHL has ever known, Bob Probert would rack up a whopping 3,300 penalty minutes in just 935 games during his 16-year NHL career, the 5th highest total of any player in league history. God, they really don't make them like Probert anymore, do they? During the early years of his NHL career though, the Canadian forward would face one fight he couldn't win, as on March 3rd, 1989, Probert was arrested for possession of cocaine at the US-Canadian border. According to the reports, Probert was found with 14 grams of cocaine that he had attempted to hide in his underwear, but the drugs were spotted by US customs agents and the forward was quickly detained by law enforcement. Because of this, Probert was charged with the importation of cocaine into the US and was forced to serve a 6-month sentence, 3 months in a federal prison and 3 months in a halfway house. Now, while Probert would be suspended indefinitely from the NHL, this ban was quickly lifted after his jail time concluded, and following several appeals to various different government bodies, he was allowed to continue his NHL career without any kind of complications. Unfortunately though, this wouldn't be Probert's only incident with the law, as on July 15th, 1994, he was detained by police again after he crashed his motorcycle into a car. Though he was fortunate enough to only suffer minor injuries from the crash, Probert's alcohol level was said to have been triple the legal limit, and the forward also had trace amounts of cocaine in his system too, which resulted in a drunk driving charge and a brief hiatus from his NHL career in order to undergo a mandatory rehab. Given his continued struggles with substance abuse throughout his career, and given that he passed away at just 45 years old in July of 2010, Probert certainly didn't have it easy, but he would always do his utmost to protect his teammates. So it's important to recognise the good alongside the bad, right? On to our next entry, we have Brett Sutter. One of the lesser-known members of the storied Sutter family, Brett would end up playing just 60 NHL games over parts of 8 seasons split between 3 different teams, where he scored 2 goals and 10 points during that span. Now, in the midst of his 3rd stint in the show, Sutter would be detained by law enforcement, as on November 10th, 2010, the Canadian forward was arrested for assault in Scottsdale, Arizona. According to reports at the time, Sutter was said to have been removed from the American Junkie Bar due to his intoxicated state, before allegedly punching a cab driver in the face and giving him a bloody lip. Since witnesses had told police that the driver didn't do or say anything to provoke Sutter, the cops detained the forward at the scene and awarded him with 2 misdemeanor assault charges. Following a brief stay in jail and a trade to the Carolina Hurricanes just a week after the incident, Sutter would eventually plead guilty to disorderly conduct charges in July of 2011, and he was fined $323.60 for the incident. God, that's a very specific number, isn't it? Now, while a $300 fine won't break the bank for a professional hockey player, given that he was traded only a week after the incident, and given that he never secured a permanent spot in the NHL in the many years after this event, if you can't do the time, don't do the crime, folks. Moving on, we have Steve Durbano. A former first-round draft pick and a noted heavyweight throughout his pro career, Steve Mental Case Durbano would play 220 NHL games, score 73 points during that span, and rack up a whopping 1,127 penalty minutes while he was at it too. The guy averaged over 5 penalty minutes a game throughout his entire NHL career. That's basically one fight for every contest he played. Just a few years after his pro career concluded though, the Canadian defenseman would face his first of many run-ins with the law. On February 7th, 1981, Durbano was arrested on board a flight at Toronto International Airport after being found in possession of 474 grams of cocaine, estimated to be worth approximately $71,000, that he had attempted to hide in the false heels of his shoes. Though some would get the message and take this punishment on the chin, Durbano wasn't one of those people. Only a couple of years later, in 1983, Durbano would be arrested again for attempting to smuggle approximately $500,000 worth of cocaine into Canada from the United States. Now, due to the value of his cargo and his previous similar incident, Durbano was convicted of drug skulking and was sentenced to 7 years in prison, though he was eventually released after serving just 2 years in jail. Oh, but we're not done there, folks. After being arrested for shoplifting during the late 1980s, Durbano would be detained for a 4th time in 1995. According to reports at the time, Durbano had posted an ad for a high-end escort service, and after meeting with a woman in an attempt to recruit her, the lady turned out to be an undercover cop who arrested him on the spot. As a result, Durbano would be sent back to prison for a 2nd time, but would only serve 3 months for his crimes. So not only did he attempt to smuggle cocaine on 2 separate occasions, Steve Durbano had been caught shoplifting and had operated a prostitution ring too. Are we talking about the NHL or The Godfather? Because I have no idea what's going on anymore. Now we have Nikolai Khabibulin. A 4-time NHL All-Star and a 2004 Stanley Cup champion, Nikolai Khabibulin would spend parts of 18 seasons in the league split between 5 different teams, where he posted a 333, 334, 58 and 39 record, a 2.72 goals against average, and a .907 save percentage in 799 regular season games. During the tail end of his career on February 8, 2010, the Russian netminder would be taken into custody, as he was arrested for speeding in Arizona. According to the report, Khabibulin, who was with the Edmonton Oilers during the 09-10 NHL season and had supposedly been rehabbing an injury at the time, was pulled over by law enforcement for surpassing the speed limit by 25 miles an hour. Once he was pulled over, the officer on scene noted various signs that suggested Khabibulin could be under the influence of alcohol, so he administered a field sobriety test, and after the results showed that his alcohol level was above the legal limit, the netminder was slapped with charges of speeding and impaired driving. Though his court date would be pushed back from July 7th to August 27th of 2010, Khabibulin was eventually found guilty of excessive speed, extreme DUI, and DUI over the 0.08 limit. Just 4 days later, on August 31st, Khabibulin would be sentenced to 30 days in jail, and though he would try to appeal this sentence, the Russian would withdraw his appeal on July of 2011 and begin his 30-day jail sentence. That said, Khabibulin would only spend half of his sentence in Joe Apario's Tent City jail before spending the other half of his time under house arrest instead. Given that he was 37 years old at the time of this incident, and given that he would play just 16 NHL games in the 2 seasons after finally serving his sentence, this conviction didn't affect Khabibulin's career all that much, but it's still a rather noticeable blemish on an otherwise impressive resume. And that's why you don't drink and drive, kids. Next, we have Patrick Cote. Veteran of just 105 NHL games, Patrick Cote would play for 3 different teams during his time in the show. He would score just 3 points for his efforts, and he would rack up 377 penalty minutes during that span. Averaging over 3 minutes in the box for every single game that you played is the perfect way to show people that you use your fists more than you use your hockey stick, folks? In the years following his final stint in the show, the Canadian forward would somehow get himself involved into all sorts of trouble. In 2002, Cote was pulled over for speeding before being charged with possessing more than 14 kilograms worth of marijuana, and he had also compiled a lengthy criminal record that included drugs, assault, robbery, aggravated assault, and even breaking and entering too. However, the craziest of them all took place in May of 2014. According to reports at the time, Cote had been pulled over by Ontario police when patrol officers realised that the car Cote was driving had been reported stolen. After being taken to the station for questioning, Cote admitted to the investigators that he had robbed 2 different Canadian banks using the stolen vehicle, one CIBC branch earlier that month and a Laurentian bank just a few days later. As a result, Cote would be sentenced to 30 months in prison for confessing to these crimes, a punishment he would serve shortly after. His NHL career didn't last very long, but Cote's crimes sure were unique. I mean, the guy committed some pretty crazy acts compared to his contemporaries in this video. If that's not how you make an impression, I don't know what is. On to our next entry, we have Ryan Malone. A solid middle six forward throughout his career, Ryan Malone would suit up in 647 NHL games over parts of 11 seasons split between 3 different teams, where he potted 179 goals and 370 points for his efforts. Towards the tail end of his pro career, the American forward would get in trouble with the law, as on April 12, 2014, Malone was arrested by police in Tampa for driving under the influence and possession of cocaine. According to the reports, Malone had made a left turn from the centre lane and had struck the curb early in the morning, prompting the police to pull him over for a routine traffic stop. When law enforcement stopped Malone and the forward got out of his vehicle, the officer could smell alcohol on his breath before searching him and finding 1.3 grams of cocaine in one of Malone's pockets. Though he would refuse to take a field sobriety test at the scene, Malone would take a breath test once he had been taken into custody and recorded blood alcohol levels of 0.112 and 0.116%, much higher than Florida's legal limit of 0.08. After being released from jail and after posting a $2,500 bond in order to do so, Malone's attorney would enter a not guilty plea on May 1st, 2014, before the forward pleaded no contest to the charges on August 19th, 2014. Because of this, Malone was given 12 months probation and he agreed to undertake a pre-trial diversion program, which included having his driver's license suspended for 6 months, as well as undergoing 50 hours of community service too. Oh, and the Tampa Bay Lightning also bought out the final season of his 7-year, $31.5 million contract that would have seen him earn $4.5 million during the 14-15 NHL season alone. And considering he would make just a fraction of that over the next 2 years as a result of this buyout, Malone's tenure with the Lightning couldn't have ended under more disappointing circumstances. At least he signed with the Rangers shortly after. That turned out pretty well for him, right? Right? Moving on, we have Slava Voynov. A promising young defenseman during his 4-year stint in the show, Slava Voynov would play 190 NHL games, all with the Los Angeles Kings. He would score 81 points during that span, and he would lift both the 2012 and the 2014 Stanley Cups as a member of the Kings. Talk about making the most of your opportunity, folks? Though his NHL career was only just getting started, and though he had already won more championships than most players ever do, the Russian defenseman would watch it all come crashing down. On October 20th, 2014, Voynov was arrested by Redondo Beach police on misdemeanor domestic violence charges against his wife Marta Varlamova. According to reports at the time, Varlamova told police that Voynov had punched, kicked and choked her, and after officers on scene noticed that Varlamova had a cut above her eye, she told them that her husband had pushed her into a flat-screen TV. While Voynov would initially be charged with misdemeanor domestic violence, on November 20th, 2014, the LA County prosecutor announced that the defenseman would instead be charged with, quote, one felony count of corporal injury to a spouse with great bodily injury, a charge that could have seen Voynov serve up to 9 years in prison, as well as a possible deportation back home to Russia. Though Voynov would plead not guilty on December 1st, 2014, and there would be another date in court on December 15th, less than 24 hours after that hearing on December 16th, TMZ published a letter that Varlamova had written to the LA District Attorney asking for Voynov to not be charged, citing that her husband had not intended to injure her that night. These claims were further supported by Voynov's attorneys, who claimed that the police had misunderstood what Varlamova had told them that night because she doesn't speak English, and they maintained that the victim's injuries were caused by her falling down instead. After several months of legal proceedings, and with much uncertainty as to what would happen, on July 2nd, 2015, Voynov would reach a plea deal with the courts. Instead of being charged with a felony, Voynov pled no contest to a reduced misdemeanor charge instead, resulting in him receiving a 90-day jail sentence, 3 years probation, and an order to attend counselling too. Once he was released from prison on September 3rd, 2015, Voynov was taken into custody by US immigration, and following a brief hold, the defenseman elected to return home to Russia before deportation proceedings got underway. In fact, Voynov has never returned to North America ever since, as he has spent the last 8 years playing exclusively in Russia's KHL, and he has yet to be officially reinstated by the league, despite serving his season-long suspension to the NHL several years ago now. Though he was granted a dismissal of his domestic abuse conviction in July of 2018, and though he would fulfill his 3 years of probation without any further incidents, given that Voynov had his 6-year, $25 million contract terminated by the Kings, and given that he never played another NHL game after his arrest, it just goes to show how one event can not only change your career, but the course of your entire life. Penultimately, we have Casey Cizikas. The only entry in this video to still be active in the league today, Casey Cizikas has spent the last 12 seasons in the NHL playing exclusively with the New York Islanders, where he has scored 97 goals and 222 points in 745 regular season games. Now, before his NHL career began though, the Canadian forward would find himself entangled in quite the tragic incident, as in 2007, Cizikas was arrested by Peel Regional Police under suspicion of manslaughter. According to the reports, Cizikas, who was playing for the OHL's Mississauga St. Michael's Majors at the time, was taking part in a rugby game and tackled a man by the name of Manny Castillo to the ground in what Cizikas described as a headlock. Now, while Cizikas would get up just fine from the tackle, Castillo wouldn't, as he was rushed to hospital with a head injury and he was pronounced dead just 2 days later. Now, while there are conflicting reports as to whether Cizikas' tackle was clean or dirty, it's worth mentioning that Manny Castillo had suffered a major concussion just 2 weeks before the rugby game took place, and he had supposedly been advised by doctors to avoid playing sports for up to a year due to the damage that he had sustained. However, Castillo ignored this advice, took part in the rugby game, and suffered an injury that ultimately ended his life. Though Castillo's family supported Cizikas throughout this ordeal, and they never once asked for him to be punished for what they believed to be a tragic accident, the Peel Police Department supported this conviction, since Cizikas' tackle had ultimately led to Castillo's death, and the circumstances surrounding the incident couldn't be ignored. After 2 years of waiting and bitter legal proceedings, Cizikas was found guilty of manslaughter in 2009, with the judge citing that the forward had used unnecessary force during the tackle. As a result, Cizikas was sentenced to 1 year probation and was required to complete 100 hours of community service. Now, while I understand that the police have to uphold the law, and while I get that the courts have to punish wrongdoers, I really don't think it was all that necessary in this situation, do you? I mean, Cizikas was only 16 years old at the time, he made a routine tackle during a contact sport, and the victims' families made it abundantly clear that they didn't want him to be punished. It was clearly a freak accident, so what was there to gain for convicting Cizikas of manslaughter? It's fun to joke about some of these crimes and to try to keep things lighthearted, but this one is just simply awful for everybody involved. At least Cizikas was able to move past this and produce a long and successful NHL career, right guys? And finally, we have Danny Heatley. One of the top goal scorers of his era, Danny Heatley would play 13 seasons in the NHL, score 372 goals and 791 points in 869 games, and earn plenty of accolades during that span, including 4 All-Star nods, the 2002 Calder Trophy for Rookie of the Year, as well as an Olympic gold medal with Team Canada too. Oh, and he also registered 2 50-goal seasons and a pair of 100-point seasons too, just in case you weren't impressed already. Now, just weeks before his 3rd NHL season began, the German-born forward would become embroiled in one of the worst incidents in this entire video, as on September 29, 2003, Heatley was arrested for vehicular homicide. According to the police reports, Heatley had been driving his Ferrari with Atlanta Thrashers teammate Dan Snyder when he took a turn and struck a wall. As the car split in half, both Heatley and Snyder were ejected from the vehicle, and while Heatley would walk away with a broken jaw, a concussion, and 3 torn ligaments in his right knee, Snyder was critically injured with a fracture to his skull. Though Heatley would make a full recovery, Snyder would soon succumb to his injuries, as he died in hospital on October 5, 2003 after contracting sepsis from his wounds. While Heatley's blood alcohol level was below the legal limit at the time of the incident, and while Snyder's family told the court that nothing would be gained from imprisoning him, the forward faced a first-degree charge of vehicular manslaughter, which meant that he could have been sentenced for up to 15 years in jail. However, Heatley would eventually accept a plea deal before the case got to trial, as he pled guilty to 2nd-degree vehicular manslaughter, driving too fast for conditions, failure to maintain a lane, and speeding too. Because of this, Heatley was sentenced to 3 years probation, while the judge ruled that the forward could no longer drive a vehicle that surpassed 70 miles per hour. Though he never intended to take his teammate's life, and while these actions have likely haunted him ever since, Danny Heatley was pretty fortunate to only suffer a few broken bones for such a dangerous and reckless act. I mean, the guy would somehow reach new heights in the years after this incident, and he avoided some pretty serious jail time while he was at it too. He was lucky to even be alive at this point, let alone produce a decorated NHL career. It's just a shame that Dan Snyder couldn't say the same, right guys? And on that note, I'm going to end today's video. That was a look at 10 more NHL players who were arrested by police. What do you guys think about the skaters that were discussed, or the reasons for their arrests? Are you surprised to see some of the names that were mentioned here, or did I leave somebody completely obvious out? Also, do you want me to look at some more arrested players and make a part 3? Do let me know in the comments below, I would love to hear what you guys have to say. But thank you very much for watching guys, I do hope you have enjoyed. Please feel free to like, subscribe, share, watch some of my other videos. Thank you very much for watching, and goodbye. A big thank you to Bexy93, Burned Retinas, Drew Fawcett, Houston NG, Raquel and Worthless Pieces for helping support this video via Patreon. If you too want to help support the channel a little bit further and get a shout out at the end of every future video, make sure you head over to patreon.com/oddmanrush and become a patron today.